Hey there, Robert Warren here, author of the Bitcoin Miners Almanac, and we're going to settle a debate today. What the heck is hashing? I've heard a lot of explanations about what Bitcoin mining is, what it does. Having authored the book, The Bitcoin Miners Almanac, I thought I'd throw my hat in the ring and try to settle the debate once and for all. Okay, so what is a hash? Here's a description, an actual description from a lawsuit regarding what Bitcoin mining is and what it does on the network. It says each miner seeking to participate attempts to solve a puzzle on the network. Okay, what kind of puzzle? Every 10 minutes, one miner is chosen at random, and that miner wins the right to record all Bitcoin transactions into the decentralized ledger that took place since the last contest. Okay, well, this is real. I assume high-paid attorneys were producing this, and this is what it makes me feel like. Not because it's necessarily wrong. It is wrong in some ways, but because it is inelegant and inappropriate. It just doesn't understand fundamentally what the heck is actually happening in the world of hashing. So, how do we understand this? We're going to start with the smallest unit of Bitcoin mining. And what is that? It's the machine. So, the first question you might have is, what the heck is it actually doing? And the answer obviously would be, it is making magical internet money. Okay, that's a good starting point. I have a machine, it makes magical internet money. Now, where do we go from there? I want to run this machine. Okay, it does three things, or it needs three things rather to operate. And that's all it needs to operate, three things. It needs a connection to the internet. Okay, it has to talk to a network. It needs a connection to power. I have to power it. And it needs some form of cooling, some form of physical cooling. It might be just running fans over it. It might be dipping it in immersion oil. It might be running water through cooling blocks inside of it. It might even be throwing it into a solvent and using a two-phase cooling method that's relatively new in the market. But you only need three things to operate this machine, and that's totally scale invariant. It doesn't matter how small it is, it doesn't matter how big it is, or if you have one or if you have many, you're always going to need those three things. So if you look here at the scale of what would be considered like a large industrial miner, air coming in one side, going through a rack of machines and exiting out the other, this building operates in the exact same way that a single Bitcoin miner operates. It needs electricity, it needs internet, and it needs cooling. It just does it in a different way. All it does is, instead of being a single machine that makes magic internet money, it's now a large facility that makes magic internet money. And all it needs are three things: electricity, internet, cooling. You're solving for the problem at a very different scale, but it's fundamentally the same problem. So we hear that Bitcoin miners hash. What is hashing? What the heck is this? Okay, well, in the most esoteric or most conceptual kind of way, it's work. Hashing equals work. And it's work that we as miners get paid to do. That's great. You do work. It shouldn't be for free. You should get paid to do it. That work has a known value, a known commodity value. What does that mean, a known commodity value? It means that the amount of work that you put in is always going to, or at any point in time, it's knowable how much it will make you. So that commodity value won't stay the same in the same way that the price of gasoline when you go to the pump, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, but it is essentially a known commodity price. It all kind of trends around a commodity value, a known value. Now, how do we do that work? To do that work, instead of moving trucks or instead of going to space or instead of mining something out of the ground, we consume electricity. Electricity is one of those three requirements: electricity, internet, cooling. Now, the more efficiently I do that work, the more money I make. This makes sense. If my vehicle made me money, you would be dang sure that I would be selling my Tundra and I would be buying a Prius. Because for every gallon of gas that I put into my vehicle, I would want to make as much money as possible. Now, what does that look like in the world of mining? It's a bit of an inversion of what you might think of in terms of miles per gallon, where in the world of cars, the higher number is better. I want 80 miles per gallon or 100 miles per gallon. I don't want 17, 15 miles per gallon in my huge SUV. In the world of Bitcoin mining, we use something called joules per terahash. So joules, it's the way in which we're looking at the electricity, the energy, the power that goes into the machine, the work. Per terahash, there's that word hash. Tera just means trillion. Per trillions of hashes, and let's get a little bit more deep into what that hashing thing is. So it's effectively, I put in this much energy, this much work, and I get this much hash out. I want that number to be as low as possible. If I could put in no energy and get lots of work, I would have an infinite money glitch. But that's not the way that the world of physics or the world of Bitcoin mining works. So we are constantly trying to trend towards greater efficiency. And what does that work do? What does it do? Well, it keeps the Bitcoin network functional. Functional. Now, this is a really important division because hashing, mining as we call it in the world of Bitcoin, it does two things for the Bitcoin network. Fundamentally two things. It helps you settle Bitcoin and it helps you issue Bitcoin. I know specifically that when I got introduced to Bitcoin, I only thought of it as an asset. I buy some, and the hardest thing I have to do after I buy some is figure out how to custody it, how to hold it. However, it's much more than that. And it took me, in all honesty, a couple of years to actually figure that out. I thought it was simply a thing that I bought and I held like I was storing potatoes in my basement or gold in my vault. But in reality, Bitcoin is not just an asset. It's not just the thing that you see when you open up your Ledger wallet or your cold card. It is a functional network. It is a living, breathing thing in some sense. And what is it doing through mining? It's sort of the verb, the active aspect of what Bitcoin is. It's doing two things. It's settling Bitcoin, settling transactions, and it's issuing new Bitcoin. That's what Bitcoin mining does. That's what all of this hashing is leading to in the functioning of the network. Now, by settling Bitcoin, what we mean is that, and you can see a beautiful image here from mempool.space, which in my opinion is the most beautiful viewer of what's happening on the Bitcoin blockchain. It's settling Bitcoin in the sense that all these small squares you see in this larger square are transactions that individuals have submitted to what's called the mempool, the memory pool. And those transactions are candidates for being picked up in what's called a block by a miner, being hashed and being added to the blockchain. So hashing, mining, fundamentally helps you do this thing called settling Bitcoin. It lets me transact with it. It's not that I just hold it. It's that it's the actual mechanism. Mining is the mechanism by which I send it and settle it with somebody else. Okay, what's the second thing? The issuance of Bitcoin. The issuance of Bitcoin. So every block that is added to the blockchain receives a reward, and that reward is paid in Bitcoin. Now, this is sort of an incentive for doing the work. So approximately every 10 minutes, if you're a little familiar with Bitcoin, a block is quote unquote found. So going alongside with the settlement of Bitcoin is also the issuance of Bitcoin. And we know that there are really two mechanisms that help regulate that. There's what's called a difficulty adjustment, and there's what's called a halving. And every approximately 4 years or 210,000 blocks, the number of Bitcoins that you are rewarded for having found a block successfully is going to be cut in half. So it starts with 50, it goes from 50 to 25, 25 to 12.5, and so on and so forth until you wind up where we are today with just over 3 Bitcoin issued per block. Now, why is this an important mechanism to the functioning of the network? Well, it controls the inflation of the network. By controlling the issuance and by making it encoded into the actual operation of the network, and by making it reliant on the miners doing something, because the miners, in some sense, are being rewarded every 10 minutes by finding a block. But what they're also doing is they're also issuing Bitcoin, because at some point they will have to oftentimes sell that Bitcoin if they're going to do things like pay for their operational costs, because the energy going in is not free. So there are two mechanisms or two machines that I want you to think about when we are describing these two core functions of hashing, or what hashing does on the network. When it comes to settling Bitcoin, we're talking about the SHA-256D hash algorithm. This is what most people think about fundamentally. And when it comes to issuing Bitcoin, there are those two tools or two machines that we can think about. One is the halving, so the issuance being cut in half approximately exactly every 210,000 blocks. And then the difficulty adjustment, which we'll get into a little bit, which is the adjusting of the network, or how hard it is to find blocks approximately every 2 weeks or 2016 blocks. And you can think about this in the sense of two machines. So the top machine that I have there is this big old meat grinder that spits out uniform but differently colored blocks. So they're all kind of the same size, but they are fundamentally different. They're different colors. There's different stuff inside of them. And below, you can actually see this GIF, which is the internal works, or it's a sort of stripped down, simple version of the works of a mechanical watch. And by thinking of these two machines, you can actually understand in totality what the heck is happening when it comes to hashing, or what Bitcoin mining is doing on the network. So let's get into it. The first machine is the SHA-256D hashing algorithm. Now, this is a hashing algorithm that is fantastic for data security. It has a deterministic output and it's easy to check your work. Okay, well, what does it do? And why am I showing you a picture of a giant meat grinder looking thing? Well, fundamentally what it is it is a set of rules, it's an algorithm, that when you input data, it outputs something called a hash. That's an example of a hash. Now, what you input and what you output look nothing like each other. Nothing like each other. So if I take an email and I spit it into, or I hash it through the hashing algorithm, I'm going to get something that looks like this. Probably not with all these zeros, we'll go into the zeros, but maybe something more like this. It looks like a random string of letters and numbers. Now, why is this good? It's good for a lot of reasons. If I write a love letter to my wife, and I want to make sure that I'm not being spied on, and nobody is going to alter my love letter to my wife, what I might do is take my love letter, run it through the SHA-256 hash algorithm, and I'll produce some kind of hash. And then what I'll do is I'll send my wife the letter, and I'll send her the hash. And what she'll do, because the SHA-256 algorithm, it's a known set of rules, everybody knows the rules of the game, she will independently put that letter through the SHA-256 hash algorithm, and if it outputs the exact same hash that I sent to her, it means that nothing has changed. None of that data has changed. Now, what's really special about this hashing algorithm is that if you were to even change a letter, or to change something from capital to lowercase, or add a single period, what you get out of the SHA-256 hashing machine is an entirely different hash. A hash that in no way resembles the love letter that I wrote initially. If I change it the tiniest amount, down to the atom, and I input that data into my SHA-256 hashing machine, you'll see that I get something out that is entirely different. And there is no way fundamentally using the SHA-256 hashing algorithm for me to predict, to go backwards, to take that hash and to guess what data was put into it. So in this sense, the math only really maths one way. And this is a very powerful tool. It's a very powerful tool for data security because it's so lightweight, it's so easy to do, and it outputs something incredibly secure. Here's an example, or rather the first mention of it in the abstract of Satoshi's white paper. What are we doing? We are taking transactions. Okay, I showed you that picture of the mempool. And we're hashing them. Okay, we're running them through the SHA-256 algorithm into an ongoing chain of hash-based proof of work. That's a new term. Forming a record that cannot be changed without redoing the proof of work. That record is actually what we say when we refer to the blockchain. So the series of blocks that come one after the other. So we are hashing transactions into an ongoing chain of hash-based proof of work. Oftentimes, if we're looking at something like mempool.space, this is how you're looking at it. You're looking at it as these beautifully colored blocks that have their numbers on the top, that have some data about the transactions or the cost of transactions going into those blocks, have the number of transactions, the amount of fees earned in BTC, the time, and who found it. A more accurate way to look at the blockchain. Now, this is beautiful. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, of course, but a more technically accurate way to look at it for our purposes would actually be in this way. So if you look at block 1, you have this thing called the hash of a previous block header, which in our sense is one of these, a hash, and it gets added to something called a Merkle root, which you can think of as a summary, a deterministic summary of all the transactions. It makes it nice and data tight, but it's a summary of the transactions that go into the block. Then hashing happens to say block number 1, and that line is us outputting a new hash, a new and different hash. Okay, now what I've done is I've linked block 1 to block 2 by now outputting a hash from block 1 to block 2, adding more transactions through this thing called a Merkle root, hashing, and then I get a line to block 3. And this is what we mean when we say block chain. The thing that is chaining the blocks together is the output hash from the block before. And how does it do that? Because we use that output hash in our current block. So when we find the next block, we have necessarily linked all of these blocks together. And we've done it through this really powerful SHA-256 hashing algorithm, which is a form of one-way mathematics. Okay, there's actually a more technically accurate way to look at this. On the right-hand side of your screen, and my face is covering it up a little bit, you see the actual data or the inputs of what goes into what is hashed, that block data. So you have the version of Bitcoin. There's that previous block header hash, which is the same thing as hash of previous block header. You have something called the Merkle root hash, which we already said is the hash of all the transactions, a nice little summary of the transactions. You have the time. You have n bits, which is something called a target. And you have something called a nonce. And so all this data is being hashed through the SHA-256 hashing algorithm, that big grinder machine, and it's spitting out a hash that will become an input for the next block. So look at that. I input all of my data. I run it through the SHA-256 hashing algorithm. I get a hash. Okay, I win. Now pay me, I get some Bitcoin. This is a hash. It was very easy to do. Well, it's not so easy. You can generate a hash. Everybody can do this using the SHA-256 hashing algorithm. What is very hard to do is generate a hash the Bitcoin network actually wants. So it's easy to make a hash. It's hard to generate a hash the Bitcoin network wants. So what do we mean by this? What we mean by this is that the Bitcoin network makes it hard to find a hash that it wants. And it does this by setting a thing called a difficulty, a target difficulty. Now, why would it do that? It would do that because it doesn't want you to find tons of blocks extremely quickly. Why? Because, remember, Bitcoin mining does two things. It handles settlement and it handles issuance. I need to control the issuance of Bitcoin, which means that I can't just scoop up transactions as soon as they come in and throw them into the hashing algorithm, throw them into a block, and all of a sudden spit out one after the next after the next. That would lead to runaway inflation because you would have your Bitcoin being issued rapidly, very, very quickly. So what do? We set a target, and a target difficulty regulates that issuance in the short term to about every 10 minutes, and in the long term, every 210,000 blocks, every approximately 4 years, which is called the halving. So the first one is the difficulty adjustment, the second one is the halving. But, and this is what's so magical about what we're going to get into next, the network doesn't actually control who's allowed to hash. Anyone can set up a Bitcoin mining machine in their house and mine Bitcoin if they like. So the way that the Bitcoin mining network, the code itself, regulates the issuance of Bitcoin is by setting this thing called target difficulty, which is represented, as you can see here, in this special kind of hash. It's a hash that has a lot of zeros. Now, in terms of the actual tech behind it, it actually goes a little bit deeper in terms of what's happening. So representing it in zeros is a simplification of what we're thinking about when we refer to target difficulty, but it's the best one that we have without really getting into the weeds about representation of data. But for our purposes, you can see there's a number of zeros, quite a few zeros. Target difficulty is the network adjusting up or down how many leading zeros, effectively, have to be in a hash that you output to be the hash that the network wants. So to make it harder, for example, I would want to add more zeros. To make it easier, I would add fewer zeros. And the reason this is so is because I can't predict what comes out of my hashing machine. And because I can't predict what comes out of my hashing machine, I'm very unlikely to find something with even 4 leading zeros, substantially less likely to find one with 20. So this is the difficulty that is going up and down to regulate that. And here's the tool, here's the mechanism that we can kind of use to understand what we mean by the difficulty, or understand by this regulation of difficulty. The Bitcoin network doesn't want blocks spitting out really, really, really quickly. And so what it does is it runs a trailing average. It tries to understand, okay, am I settling on an approximately every 10-minute basis? And it checks and adjusts every 2016 blocks, or approximately every 2 weeks. And it adjusts the difficulty of finding a block up, or it adjusts it down based on how fast blocks are coming in. So they come in too fast, it has to get harder. They come in too slow, it has to come in easier. It's sort of like if you ever go to a spin class, finding the perfect place to put your little wheel, your little dial, so that you can actually spin at the cadence you want, if that's 70 rotations per minute or 90, adjusting it up or down based on how tired you are. But a way to think about it more effectively is what you see here on the right, which is the inner works of a watch. On the left-hand side of this image, you see this gray thing. It's a spring. And you can think of that spring in terms of the amount of miners on the network. When that spring is wound tight, there are a lot of miners on the network. There's a lot of pressure pushing on that chain of gears to the yellow chain of gears. When there's less, when that spring is wound down, there's a lot less pressure pushing on that yellow chain of gears. But this is a mechanism that regulates time to the second. It tick, 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 or some subdivision of that, but it regulates fundamentally a second in the same way that the difficulty adjustment is regulating time to every 10 minutes. So you have the incoming pressure through our spring. You have the chain of gears, so that yellow gear that you can think of as what is ticking, what is actually moving the hand of the watch, the mechanical watch. And then you have this blue piece. You have this little wiggling piece back and forth called a pallet fork. And then on the far right, you have a hairspring, this assembly that is ticking back and forth. Now, fundamentally, this part on the right, what is it doing? It's regulating how energy is released. It's regulating how energy is released. This is effectively what the difficulty adjustment is for the network, where it regulates, kind of ticking on a 2-week basis, how energy is released by adapting and responding to the amount of energy on the left-hand side, which is in the main spring. So this is a really effective way to think about the difficulty adjustment, and it's also a good reason why people call the Bitcoin blockchain the time chain, because fundamentally it also manages time. Okay, so here's a hash, I win, pay me. Well, no, the network doesn't want this hash. I have to keep hashing, and eventually I might find a hash that has enough leading zeros, fulfills the target difficulty. So congrats. You get to add your block to the blockchain and you get paid. But here's a trick. I told you that this SHA-256 machine is deterministic, which means that if I put my love letter in, I only get one hash. If I put my love letter in again, I only get one hash. That hash doesn't necessarily fulfill the difficulty network, or the difficulty, the target difficulty. So what does that mean? Because I have a deterministic machine, but I want something that's variable coming out of it. I have to add something else. And we went over this in a prior slide, which is the nonce. So the difficulty adjustment sets a target hash, or a target difficulty that I have to get to. The nonce is the mechanism that I use to find it. Now, what is a nonce? A nonce is a portmanteau for a number used only once. And fundamentally, what is it? It is a random number. So when I throw that number into my data that you see here on the right-hand side, my version, my previous block header hash, my Merkle root hash, the time, the n bits, I can throw out a hash that looks different. And I can do this over and over and over again because I'm changing the input data and I am now pushing out different output data. And it's 100% deterministic because I'm iterating on this nonce, this random number. And I'm gonna a lot of times just spit out stuff that I don't want. In fact, the vast majority of the time, I'm gonna spit out something that I don't want. And very infrequently, I might spit out something that has a couple of leading zeros. But because there is no way to work this math backwards, the math only maths one way, I can't use the nonce that I just guessed that gave me 2 zeros to then figure out the one that's going to give me 20 to fulfill the target difficulty. I can't. The only thing that my machine can do is keep guessing nonces, inputting it to the data set, taking that data set, hashing it, checking if it fulfills the difficulty, throwing it out if it doesn't, and doing it all over again. So the odds of generating a hash that fulfills the target difficulty is almost statistically impossible for any single machine. For a single 100 terahash machine, I think I saw it most recently, somebody calculated that it would take approximately 70 to 72 years for that machine itself to find a block. So very, 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 very low likelihood. Now the question you might be asking yourself is, how do these miners get paid if they aren't finding blocks? That's a lesson for another day, which goes into pools and pool payment schemes. But fundamentally, understand that we're doing something really difficult. One way to think about it is if you're playing this big ring toss game. And what's happening is that anybody can come and play the ring toss game if they want. And they're all throwing randomly, because the best strategy to use when you're hashing is just to randomly input a number, do it as fast as you can and efficiently as you can, in the hopes that you output a hash, which you can't predict the outcome of, in the hope that you output a hash that fulfills the target difficulty and allows you to add that block to the blockchain, because that's the only way to add a valid block to the blockchain. It's as if you were looking at this image of everybody playing their ring toss game, there was a very, very, very small subset of rings that would actually give you a reward. So maybe you have 500 here. If the difficulty is moderate, it might be that you can land on 25% of the beer bottles that are in this arena. If the difficulty is extremely high, it might be the case that you can only successfully hit 3 of them. Now the difference between hashing and this ring toss game is that in hashing, the lights are turned off. You don't know which bottles are going to be the right bottles to aim for, so you just aim randomly. Now how hard is it? We're searching for a nonce in the 2 to the 256 mathematical space, the search space. This is almost the equivalent of searching for an atom or a set of atoms in our known universe. It's an immense mathematical space, which is why it is so stinking difficult to do. And that's why we call it proof of work. Because fundamentally, these machines have to continuously do this work of inputting a nonce hashing, updating their data, inputting a nonce hashing. And only when they output a hash that fulfills this very, 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 very high difficulty do they receive any credit, and are they allowed to settle Bitcoin and issue Bitcoin, receive that payment, that Coinbase reward for themselves. And this is why we mean proof of work. So what you have is not the work itself. The hash is the proof, it's the receipt, it's not the meal. And this fundamentally is how Bitcoin does 2 things: settles Bitcoin and issues Bitcoin. So this and more I talk about in my book, The Bitcoin Miner's Almanac. I appreciate you for listening through this almost 30-minute long video. If you'd like to learn more, feel free to ping me on Twitter at Bikes and Bitcoin. DMs are open. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. But fundamentally, I hope we can kind of look and settle the question of what is a hash? Because we are not solving a complex math problem. We're not solving for. We're guessing and checking. Thank you.